woman, although we'll talk about that again during the panel session. And we will basically just start, and most of all, also entertain your questions, and particularly after having seen the film. I'd like to introduce Professor Gerald Perry, who's taught at Suffolk University as well as Boston University. Quick word, I've known Jerry for a while. Gerald Perry also was in charge of the Boston University Cinematheque, which is an incredible series bringing in well-known filmmakers and screenwriters and so forth to talk with Boston University students. Gerald has also been the editor of a long-time series, a very valuable series with University of Mississippi Press called Conversations with Filmmakers. And you should look up that series of volumes of interviews with the great filmmakers. And one of the many volumes you've edited is on John Ford, the John Ford interviews. And Jerry's also been, among many other things, on juries of film festivals across the world, including the president of International Film Festival juries. I'd also like to introduce Professor John Cavallaro. Happy to see back here at our Ford events. And Professor Cavallaro has been with us before, but he's a professor of rhetoric and film studies and American studies. Can I? Yes, at Bates College. You certainly know Bates. And he has a fabulous book on ethnicity in American cinema called The Hollywood Italian American Filmmakers, directors such as Capra, Scorsese, and Tarantino, and so forth. And so we're really happy to have John here. He's also... I shut that off. I might not even...
I agree.
I didn't know I did anything there. Sorry about that. I also like to mention that John spearheaded a fantastic annual film festival at Bates College, which you should look up the website. They always have terrific films being screened every year. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over first to Professor McBride, and who wanted to say a few words about Seven Woman. We're really here to talk about the later work, so most of his later work. And I'd like to start with a question to Professor McBride about the Ford's use of color in this film, which I find fascinating.
Yeah. Sorry, can somebody adjust this? Thanks. Ford and Joseph Michel stylized this film quite a lot. This is a print made off of Laserdisc. The Laserdisc looks really good. This is a little washed up when you convert it, to a different format, but it still looks good. But Ford told students at Doc Films in Chicago, where my partner Ann went to school, Ford showed up there and he did an interview with them, and he was in bed in his pajamas, and they all sat around talking to him. And one of my friends said they knew the interview was finished when Ford stood up and started taking his pants off. But anyway, he said, I tried to keep the color down to a minimum at first, until the shot where the girl puts on the Mandarin coat. And I wanted the audience to have a visual shock with color, And that scene in the hallway, the wide frame is, sort of blocked off, and in the middle you see her in this Mandarin coat. And as a matter of fact, Ford's preferred title for this film was The Mandarin Coat, but MGM said no, and they gave him a list of titles, and they picked Seven Women. But it is a very beautifully stylized color film, very stunning if you see a good print. I saw a 35 millimeter print once. I borrowed the MGM studio print and showed it to Jane Chang in a screening room at Sunset Boulevard. And I was mortified because Alan Arkush, who directed Rock and Roll High School, which I helped write, and Paul Bartel, who was another director, were sitting there making jokes about the film in front of the actress who was in the film. And I lost all respect for both of them at that point. It was just horrifying. But that's the kind of attitude people have, wise guys. But I just wanted to quote one line. Andrew Sarris, when I mentioned American reviewers trashed the film, there were three honorable exceptions. Andrew Sarris in The Village Voice wrote a wonderful review. David Ehrenstein, I'm not sure what publication, it was called December, some small publication. It was called Ford's Apocalypse, great title. And my friend Richard Thompson, who's now teaching in Australia, wrote a very powerful piece. He compared Ford to Duke Ellington. He said, like Duke Ellington, Ford goes his own way regardless of fashions, and he's the master, you know. I always thought that was a wonderful comparison, you know. But anyways, Sarah's had a great line, and then I'll turn it over to the gang here. He said, the last champions of John Ford have now gathered around 7 women as a beacon of personal cinema. And I just love that quote. And while I was spending 30 years writing my biography, I kept taking heart from that line. I would remember it when I was feeling low, and, you know, we're the last champions of John Ford. But the list grows of champions of John Ford. If you just see this film, you know, you feel like, why did they miss the beauty of this film at the time? But anyway, we'll turn it over to John and Jerry.
Oh, yeah. I would like to, we may have competing microphones, which, so Joe has Jerry might have a different take on stuff at the moment, so.
Well, I was getting, I was going to say just what we wanted to discuss, just put it into your mind, is what we call him the late Ford, and it's very arbitrary. I think we decided that we'll want to say at least a little about a couple of these films. Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, Donovan's Reef, and we're adding Sergeant Rutledge, sure, Sergeant Rutledge. So I said, but anyway, just that general last group of movies, and Cheyenne Autumn, which I'm excited about. Yeah, so I am one of those people. I've now seen 7 Women 3 times, and I'm one up till 4 days ago. I think I would be. Can I say on my dear friend Joe's shit list, because I didn't like 7 Women. I thought it was kind of cold, and I still have some trouble getting emotionally into the movie. Intellectually, I understand it. I can talk about it, but I guess I still have to say I don't feel that much about what happens to the people in this movie, that's late. You can't force an emotion. But what's great about Ford is that everybody can have their own favorite Fords, and you also can have films that everybody loves that you don't feel that strongly about, or have a movie that you are crazy about that nobody else likes. A gentleman last night told me Rising of the Moon is his favorite of all Ford movies, and I said to him, God, you're the first person that I've ever heard say that. But I really like that. That's so great that that's your favorite. So I don't think if Joe and I disagreed, I should say that Joe and I have known each other literally for 55 years, because we were students at the University of Wisconsin and have been friends that long. If we argue about some Ford movies, that's nothing to do with our dear friendship. And I'm not pulling rank on poor John over there, who I met 5 minutes ago. But what a good 5 minutes, really, a quality 5 minutes. He's a hell of a guy. Okay, so just think about, if you want to talk about any of those movies, we're here to talk about them. Yeah. Okay, so in my homework, I try to start watching some of these movies, and to my surprise, when I looked at Cheyenne Autumn, and Cheyenne Autumn, I guess this will be my longest talk, I don't know if it is, a movie which is usually maligned by just about everybody as a really boring, didactic. John Ford is so tired at the end of his life. He's trying to make up for what he did about Indians, but he just does it in this really pedantic, didactic, tiresome, boring way. And that's pretty much everybody's word. Not everybody. There's a rare exception. Anyway, I watched it. I've avoided watching it for years because I don't want that to happen. And to my surprise, watching it 3 days ago, I really liked it. I thought Cheyenne Autumn was terrifically interesting. And I can say I'm kind of a leftist auteurist. I am often interested in films from a political point of view. And and one of the things I love about John Ford is the politics is so in front in his films, and sometimes I like what he says, and sometimes I don't like what he says. And I feel that he shifted over the years, that he sort of a chameleon about his politics, that you know, I'm going to say something about, this is Portland, Maine, 100 years ago. When he lived here, this isn't today's, you know, hip, cool, you know, the best food in the whole earth is here in this town and all that. When he lived here, you know, it was can I say it was a provincial place. He was a blue-collar kid from a provincial town. And I think he carried a lot of that all through his life, that you know, he knew a lot of people, but he sort of surrounded himself with people he thought about. But once in a while, he was really influenced politically, often by screenwriters. Some of his leftist screenwriters led him left for a while, and then he seemed to wander into some centrist or sort of conservative centrist position. But I think a big moment was the presidency of John Kennedy. That when Kennedy came, he loved Kennedy, and he became a liberal for a couple of years before he stopped being a liberal and loved Nixon and was for the Vietnam War. But in this little cocoon time, he made Cheyenne Autumn. And I was just telling somebody a few minutes ago that I think Cheyenne Autumn has these several breakthroughs that never happened in all of Ford films before. Political breakthroughs, which I completely commended and was so excited to see. So one of the things that annoys me about Ford often is that although he is critical of the military sometimes for what they do, in the end, every character falls in line and continues to fight with the military. And this is from Fort Apache, John Wayne joining the battle at the end, even though he's not against it, to the Long Prairie Line. Marty, his young kids die in the Second World War, but he stays at West Point for the rest of his life. At the end of this movie, only the big thing is, even though you don't like what the military is doing, you must follow the orders. Follow the orders. I hate that in John Ford. I'm an anarchist kind of person. In this movie, the person at the end of the movie who insists that orders be followed in Cheyenne Autumn, this is a character like Carl Malden, is a maniac. He's pathological, he's crazy, and everybody disobeys his orders. 3 different people. He's arrested by his own men, a coup d'etat that would have never happened before in Ford. One guy runs to Washington complaining about him, that would have never happened in Ford. So that's incredible to me. So in this movie, orders should not be obeyed if they are crazy. Ford has never done that before. Cheyenne Autumn, 1960. The other big thing, even in movies like Fort Apache, which seem to be on the side of the natives, at the end there's a battle, same with the searchers, and there's this really facile switch which turns you around and you're suddenly rooting for the white guys to kill the Indians. And that happens at the end of the battles, the end of certainly the end of Fort Apache. It's astonishing how this changed around after Colonel Thursday has ruined the Indians by lying to the Indians. At the end, there's a battle, and you're suddenly on the other side. At the end of Cheyenne Autumn, there is a scene in which the natives break out of this little hole, and they're faced, and they're fighting with the cavalry, and you root for the Indians to kill the cavalry. Unbelievable for Ford. Never before in a movie did I see him actually be on the other side. So this, movie which nobody likes and feels is tired is actually quite avant-garde and a complete change for John Ford a zillion years into his career. So I was really excited. So go see Cheyenne Autumn. It's wonderful.
There's a lot to say. Jerry and I, as he said, we've been pals for a long time. He was the guy who told me when I first started getting interested in Ford in the late 60s. I had seen Liberty Valance the first time we played in theaters, which is the only Ford film I saw in theaters, but I'd seen The Last Hurrah. But I started getting into Ford because of Fort Apache, and I totally disagree with his interpretation. I think that when I was a kid, I saw Western every day on TV, and then on Saturdays, and I was the little guy who was getting beaten up all the time in school, so I was for the underdog, and I started seeing these Westerns, and Indians kept losing, and I thought, I didn't get it. I said, why are these Indians losing all the time. So I started wishing for a Western in which the Indians would win. And one day I came home and there was Foreman Tom's Jamboree and there was a Western and the Indians won and I was ecstatic. I don't know what it was. It could have been Fort Apache because there aren't very many, but so I saw it again in '67 and it just knocked me out. It's not only do they win, they're the heroes of the film. And you certainly are not rooting for the cavalry at the end, but the complexity is you care about the cavalrymen as human beings, and Ford doesn't demonize them as monsters. But Colonel Thursday is a madman. He's described that way by Ward Bond's character, and so Wessels and Cheyenne Autumn is another madman. But anyway, Jerry, when I met him, he said, "You got to see a movie called The Searchers." And I'd heard the title and that was about it. He said, "You gotta see that." So Mike Wellington and I got on a bus, went to Chicago and saw The Searchers in 35 millimeter at a grindhouse in the Loop, and we were so thrilled, and that kind of helped launch us on this. But I'll just say one thing about Cheyenne Autumn. There's so much to be said about that. I've had great trouble with that film. I'm not a superstitious person, but terrible things happened to me the first 3 times I saw that film. Really disastrous things. I guess I won't go into them right now, but I began thinking it's about genocide, and it's just, Orson Welles said that he thought evil was a real thing that exists in the world, and I feel the presence of evil when I see that film. It really shakes me. It's like watching Schindler's List, and it really took me a long time before I could watch it. And I did the commentary for the DVD for Warner Brothers, and I said, well, there's some obvious flaws in the film. Like, Ford wanted to make the film as a low-budget film like The Grapes of Wrath in black and white, and he wanted only actors with native ancestry to play the chiefs, and such as Richard Boone and Anthony Quinn, for example, they were mentioned. But the only way he could get the film made was as a big epic, and it was the most expensive film of his career. And Warner Brothers, for whatever reason, insisted on Mexican actors to play the Indians. So you had Ricardo Montalban and Gilbert Roland, who actually I think are good. They're good, and Dolores Del Rio, who's beautiful and wonderful and good. But there were a lot of other compromises in the film that he had to make. And then they cut the film before it had a wide release. So it's kind of a film maudit, French call it, cursed film. But I said, let's admit these problems, but this was the reality. And also the film is really based on The Last Flight, a novel by Howard Fast, who was a communist writer who wrote Spartacus also. And he claimed Ford had plagiarized the film from that book, which I think is true. And Warner Brothers had to pay a big settlement to him, but they wouldn't give him credit. It's not really based on Mary Sandoz's Cheyenne Autumn. They just used the title. It's a beautiful title. But when I did the commentary, Warner Brothers lawyers censored 10 things I said in the commentary because they were dodgy. Like I talked about Howard Fast claiming they stole I guess I could see if I were a lawyer at Warner Brothers, I wouldn't want that in the commentary. But it's all provable. I mean, I interviewed people and I had documents. And, it's all. Read the novel, The Last Flight. It's great. But anyway, Cheyenne Autumn is a complex film. But I thought the late period of Ford starts with Sergeant Rutledge, a very brave film about black troopers, has some problems. But then Two Rode Together, Liberty Valance, the Civil War section of How the West Was Won, which is great. Jean-Marie Straub considered that Ford's masterpiece, that short segment. Donovan's Reef, Cheyenne Autumn, and this film. So I'd like to turn it over to John. John wrote a wonderful book on Irish and Italian filmmakers in America, and when I did my Frank Capra biography, I learned a lot about that. Immigrant filmmakers or filmmakers from immigrant families and how they dealt with America. And Ford is one of them.
Yeah. Is this one working too?
Yeah.
Okay. The late Ford is not appreciated. I actually should say beforehand that there are these legendary stories in the film studies community about those days at Wisconsin, and you guys jumping in cars and driving to Los Angeles and knocking on people's doors So are they true?
Yeah, pretty much, and fist fights too. We had John Ford kind of brawling at meetings and stuff, right?
Well, there's 2 days with lots of Reznor, it's pretty good,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Jerry came, he was interviewing Dorothy Arzner, he invited me to come along, and we were driving toward her house out in the desert, and he said, "What is that?" And I said, "It's a Roadrunner just jumped in front of our car, Jerry." He said, "A Roadrunner? I mean, those are real?" I said, "I'm a boy from New York, here I am, and I saw a Roadrunner, oh my God." And we arrived at Dorothy Arzner's house at 9 in the morning, and we were kind of wasted, and we said, "Would you mind making us some coffee, please?" And she said, "Well, I never learned to make coffee, and my maid is out." And I thought, that's why she became a terrific director. She never learned how to make coffee. Yeah.
So all of us writing with directors, one of the things that happens when you write about directors is that repetition is rewarded. Right? So when directors evolve and they start doing new things, there are critics and there are scholars who struggle to figure out a way to fit that in. And I can't help thinking about the later Ford, that he's trying new things, and that makes it difficult for critics to make sense of it. But I think it's an interesting evolution that we see in his later works. There's still echoes of the things that he was doing before, but this film, I'll watch anything that Anne Bancroft does. Keep it with the Italian thing here. Her name is actually Anna Maria Italiana. She changed her name because she didn't ask ethnic roles and wanted something different. So I'll watch anything she does, but seeing Ford make a film that's anchored by women, it's unique, I think. You guys know his filmography better than me. Using or focusing so predominantly on the Woody Strode character in Sergeant Rutledge, naming the film after that character, was something that he hadn't really done before, right? And even though Strode had been around in his movies, and almost all of them, I think, giving him that prominence was something new. And so for those of us that love Ford and are interested in the story of his career and the story of his life and the way that he moved politically, I think the late films become really interesting. The other thing about Ford that I find fascinating is that he doesn't fit, you get into trouble if you try to categorize him a lot of the time. His politics were kind of always moving. Sometimes I think he changed opinion in the middle of a movie. And what's interesting about that is it doesn't fit really neatly into the way that our culture is now. But I think it gets at some of the complexity that other filmmakers miss. That things aren't easily defined by ideology. Things aren't easily defined by one political team versus another political team. Ford seems to get that, and that's one of the things that I appreciate about him as a filmmaker.
I would say I wrote a piece on Ford's politics for the Los Angeles Times Magazine, which is still online. And they asked, I was selling them serialization, so I thought, why don't I just pull all the political threads from throughout this long book and make it a coherent essay. I was governed a lot by, I had trouble writing a book on Ford because I couldn't figure him out for a long time. That was the point of the book. Like, how do we understand this very complicated man who said he was a socialist in the 30s and then he voted for Nixon? And here's the thing. When Ford was supporting Nixon and the Vietnam War, there was a woman in Portland, some of you may have heard of her, named Alma James, who was a lifelong friend of his, and she went to Portland High School with him, and she was a WASP from a prominent family, and he said he liked her because she was a very democratic woman she was the only non-Catholic girl at the school who would dance with Irish American boys, and he really appreciated her. And she headed a girls' school, kind of like the mission in this film, but in a benign way, because she obviously was a wonderful person. And Catherine Clifton, Ford's researcher, told me Alma James was the model, she thought, for all the dignified, strong women in Ford's films, like Clementine, Marilyn Clementine. She said, I immediately recognized Alma James, very democratic woman, we called her, And Ford's women are fascinating. I taught a whole course called Women in the Films of John Ford, and my colleagues thought, what, it's a crazy idea for a course. But there are a lot of great women in Ford, and there's a book on Ford's women. And I found a letter. I was in Ireland a few years ago, and Redmond Morris, who's the son of Lord Callanan, who was Ford's Irish relative and collaborator, gave me a letter Ford wrote to Lord Callanan when he was editing Liberty Valance. And he said, I think this is my best film. He said, strangely enough, it's a Western aimed at women. And it's a very interesting insight because Mike Wilmington and I always thought that Hallie was the central focus of that film. Vera Miles' character, she makes all the decisions in the film. Watch the film again. It's very subtle, but she's the one who's constantly controlling everything, good and bad decisions. And he said it was Western aimed at women. But he didn't say that publicly. It escaped notice, because people have this preordained notion of Ford. And when Seven Women was announced in the New York Times, one of Ford's colleagues said, Jack wanted to prove his versatility and show people he could direct a movie about women, And so I said to Ford that it was strange for you, unusual for you to direct a film all about women. It was a dumb question because he directed, Wee Willie Winkie is a terrific film. Shirley Temple's great in that film. But many other important films about women. And Ford said, well, I've directed women before, So the truth, as always with Ford, is in between those two poles, Something new for him, but he's done it before, Ava Gardner in Lugambo is very much like Anne Bancroft's performance, But it's just a great film that I think missed its. I mean, at the time, people just didn't get it; they weren't prepared for it. But anyway, I'd love to have questions on it. But any other comments?
Yeah, I'm going to jump back to Joe's earlier talk. I was hoping there was a chance for questions because I wanted Joe to talk about this moment. But the very key point that how comedy and tragedy are combined in Ford and how there's strange laughs. I was just talking to you that I had no idea in Seven Women, which I'd never seen with an audience before, that the line at the end about "you bastard" got a laugh. So there is a laugh in the middle of the tragedy in the last 15 seconds. But the one that hits me the most, Joe, please talk about it, is the moment in The Searchers. It's the scene between "Let's Go Home, Debbie" and the extraordinary poet ending, which was the scene with Ward Bond and his is it a bullet out or a stabbed in the ass. Remember, it's a completely low-life scene right after maybe the greatest moment in the history of cinema, Let's Go Home, Debbie, right before the extraordinary ending. That scene, so there is, poetry, drama, low comedy, involving someone's ass, and then the ending, which is transcendent. So, do you want to, yeah?
Yeah, actually, I had that in that speech I gave today, but I cut it for length. This essay will be in my upcoming expanded Ford book, but I mentioned that scene because that's one of the best examples of Ford's method. Ford often does this. If you look at his films, he has a very powerful emotional scene, and then he cuts to some low comedy. And the scene Jerry mentions, Ward Bond has his ass exposed, and he's leaning over and they're inspecting his ass because Pat Wayne's young cavalryman stabbed him in the ass, and it's funny, but it's ridiculous. But it's kind of a punctuation, but it also brings it down to earth. Okay, we have this transcendent moment. Now let's look at humanity in its kind of low, primitive stage. We're all in that stage. We're angels and whatever, but it's also punctuation because you need a kind of a letdown after some tremendous emotional moment, like Let's Go Home, Debbie. You can't sustain that kind of level, but then it rises again, and the ending is extremely moving. My favorite shot in all movies is the long shot where Vera Miles runs out to greet Jeffrey Hunter at the end as they're riding, and her skirt is waving in the wind. It's so beautiful. But one thing I'll mention, so watch Ford, he does that all the time. And Mel Brooks once mentioned, he said, in a drama you need comedy relief, but he said in a comedy you need serious relief. He said you can't laugh for 90 minutes straight. You need to have some scenes where you can calm down and just get some plot points or whatever, serious relief. So Ford understood that. But one thing I'll say about his politics that helped me to write the book was I was talking to Abraham Polanski, who's one of our great filmmakers, and he was blacklisted. One of the biggest losses we had was 20 years of Abe Polanski films. Great screenwriter and director, and he was a good friend of mine, and one of the most brilliant people I ever met. And I referred to Ford as conservative, and he interrupted me and said, you can't call Ford conservative or liberal. You can't categorize Ford, as John said. And Abe said, Ford is too complex to categorize. And that's what I said in my article in the LA Times, that he's all these things together. And it doesn't all cohere. I spent 3 hours once with my friend Jonathan Lethem, the novelist who loves The Searchers. And we finally concluded that it's an incoherent text. And one of the scenes that is troubling to people today is when Jeffrey Hunter kicks Look out of bed on a hillside, and she goes rolling down, this sweet, lovable Native American woman, and she falls in a heap, and you just hear this clatter of camera, and then it cuts to John Wayne laughing, and then he says, "You're really rough." So even John Wayne thinks it's rough, but Peter Lehman, who I think went to Madison, he wrote a great essay, one of the best essays I've read, on the missing shot in the Look sequence. He said if Ford had filmed a shot of Look falling at the bottom of the hill and looking hurt, the whole sequence would have been totally different, and the whole film would have been different. It's kind of a flaw in the film, and I've talked to people who said they don't like the film just because of that scene. But if Ford had filmed it, he said, I have no idea whether Ford filmed it, it was cut out, or why he didn't film it, but it's a bizarre thing. But to identify a missing element is a brilliant piece of film criticism.
Well, I hate that scene. I don't think there is a missing shot. I think Ford, when you teach, a lot of us are college, we're all college professors, and one of the things we're always teaching our students is because somebody does something in a movie or says something in a movie, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what the filmmaker believes. They are often separate, but it's one of your duties is to figure out when you feel the filmmaker has endorsed something in a film. And I always feel in The Searchers, which is my favorite film, The Searchers, I hate this sequence because I feel Ford is endorsing what happens to Luke. I feel that the worst thing about Ford as a person is the fact that, for me, is the way he belittled many people on his sets, was mean to them. I don't think there's any reason for that. It's awful, and I feel that same meanness in Ford is seen in that scene. And then the film switches, because that's Ford, and we see Luke dead, later killed by the cavalry, and he is completely mournful for Luke at that moment. And the cavalry is condemned at that moment. He's frozen, his cavalry frozen in ice. It's absolutely, they're the demons at this point. And then the movie becomes about ethnic cleansing, I think, for it. So I defend the rest of The Searchers until the ending, which I talked about before, which I feel suddenly we're on the side of the white guys killing the Indians at the end again. So it's a for me, contradictory movie, and that's Ford. That's Ford.
We're going to soon turn to a screening of Francis Ford's The Post-Telegrapher, and also we'll be looking at Francis Ford's The Craving, and Kathy Fuller-Seeley is going to give a little talk about Francis Ford, which we like to include obviously with our afternoon. I would like to take questions from the audience. Ann?
My question is to John. Which of the many light films have we not talked about enough that really strikes you as something important to say?
The late Ford films?
Yeah.
I think Sergeant Rutledge is that the right answer? It is a really remarkable film, And I went into it knowing that it had been shot in Monument Valley and that it was in a Vietnamese Western, and it is a Western. But it's very much a courtroom drama, and I felt like I was watching a Few Good Men at times as I watched that movie. He's got some beautiful shots that are silhouetted. He used lighting in an expressionistic way that I find really interesting. I think it's a great film.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, the most disturbing scene in all of, well, I don't know, there's so many, the ending of Seven Women is disturbing, because chaos, as Rick Thompson said, what does it mean for John Ford that chaos is left running loose at the end of his last feature? What does it mean for America? You know, powerful question. But in Sergeant Rutledge, there's a really great scene in which a trooper named Moffat dies on the battlefield. And Woody Strode, who's under arrest for a crime he didn't commit, rides off and trying to save Moffat, and he's been killed by the Indians, and he's been shot, and he's dying in Monument Valley, this beautiful shot, but this black trooper is dying. And he says to him, my 3 little girls, what's going to happen to them, Brax? And Sergeant Rutledge is this optimistic man who wants to believe the best of America. And he says, someday your little girls are going to be awful proud of you. And Moffat scoffs, and he says, someday, you're always talking about someday like it's going to be promised land here on Earth. And that's a recurring echo in Ford films. You heard Flora Robeson said that, this incredibly moving scene where she says, I've never been home to England. Here's an English woman who's never been home. You know, talk about a terrible situation for a Ford character. And she says, someday and she's interrupted. Whenever people say someday in the late Ford films, they're always interrupted because that's the future, and Ford doesn't know what the future will hold. But anyway, Woody Strode is holding Moffat in his arms as he dies. He says, someday your little girls, Moffat. But he says, Brax, we're fools to fight the white man's war. And then he says, we're not fighting the white man's war, we're fighting to make us proud. And right at that moment, Moffat dies, slumps over, and Woody Strode just can't bear this, you know, that his friend got killed in despair. But it really challenges the audience. What are these guys fighting for, you know? Why are they fighting? And also there's an unspoken problem in that film. The test of manhood for black people is killing Indians. And Ford, it doesn't seem aware of that in the film. I mean, it's there in the film, but it's not dealt with. But it's one of the bitter ironies of American history is that minority groups prove their worth as Americans by joining the military, but they often have to do the dirty work, you know, and in this case it's very bitter. They kill Native Americans. But what a scene. And the guy who played Moffat had never been identified. I went to the Academy Library and I found they had a long list of everybody in that film, and his name was Naaman Brown. He was a stuntman, bit player. And I wish I had found him and interviewed him. It would have been really interesting because he had some great people in that film, like Rayford Johnson and other people. But Naaman Brown had that moment of immortality that just resonates like a nightmare. You can't shake it, you know.
You know, again, my cynicism, but Sergeant Rutledge follows, again, this, what I've said is the trajectory of military movies. After it's questioned that what the black soldiers are doing, Woody Strode continues in the military, and the last shots of the movie are showing a black unit very proudly, all in their military regalia. And so once again, even though the military does some bad things, finally go with the military.
Let me just give an answer to that. I think Jerry, you know, with the best of intentions, is sort of confusing what we would like to have happen and what the world is really like. You know, I think in Fort Apache, John Wayne should either arrest or kill Henry Fonda when he says we're going to have a charge into the Indians, which is John Wayne says that's suicidal, Colonel. And he knows the whole troop is going to be wiped out, but he doesn't arrest him or shoot him. He has a perfect right to do it, you know. But that doesn't happen much in real life. People follow orders, and people in the military, how many military people break ranks and say, you know, hell with the United States. There was a story that I was taught in. Yeah, Shine On 'Em is really kind of an unusual film. But when I was a kid, there was a story we read called The Man Without a Country. You may have read this story about a guy who said, God damn the United States, and they put him on a boat and never let him back into the United States. I'm not sure what this was based on, but, you know, very few people do those kind of things. Maybe a few people in Ford movies, but part of the tragedy of Ford, and he admits the reality, is that people do re-enlist. Like Mike Mazurki in Shine On 'Em, Robin Wood mentioned this. He says we're like Cossacks. He's a Pole. He says, you know, Cossacks killed Poles, and I'm a Cossack. I'm killing Indians. Why am I doing this? He gets drunk, and then Robin Wood said, then the next morning it just cuts, and Mike Mazurki's on his horse, and nobody says anything about it. But that's life. That's what happens. You know.
I think Ford proves it. That's the big difference. Maybe Joe feels. I feel Ford believes that you finally say yes to the military. It's not that it's late. It's Ford's belief, and it is late. But Ford, you know, loves the military. He loves the military. Loves the military. And so, yeah, you don't like what the military does, but stay in the military.
Well, I think it's a tragic vision, but anyway, John, what do you think? Yeah.
I could listen to our panelists for another 2 hours, I'm sure you could too. And I love it when they disagree. For time though, we have to turn things over to the next part of our program. I guess just as a fan of their work, I would say that one of the debates that comes up, I know between Professors McBride and Perry, have to do with stereotypes of ethnic groups and racial groups and so forth. And I'm always fascinated with Ford as to how he uses stereotypes very blatantly and brazenly, but in a way that subverts them by the end of the movie, actually uses them to make a statement about stereotyping and to get audiences maybe to agree with stereotypes and then to show them it's wrong. But that's my view. And I know John, who's dealt with ethnicity as a factor in his work. John, did you want to say a final word on subverting stereotypes?
Yeah, I think we'll talk more about it tomorrow, right? And the panel after the screening of My Darling Clementine. But this too, I think, gets at those contradictions. So you watch a film like Seven Women, and you have the wonderful story about how an Asian actress is being trusted with a scene that other directors wouldn't treat or trust her with, which is great. But then you do get these representations that are troubling, to say the least, of the Chinese men in this film. And so you kind of, I think one of the things that has inspired so much criticism of Ford is that there's not an easy answer, and it's a constant debate. And sometimes in those debates, I think you learn as much about yourself or more about yourself than you do about the films that you're talking about.
Well, I'd like to thank our three panelists for joining us. And to see these films, along with the Horse Soldiers, which I think we can throw in there. Lots of medical heroes too. I just wanted to add many of these later Fords, especially in Seven Women, but in other films, even Donovan's Reef. We would like to turn things over to a screening of The Post-Telegrapher, and Professor Kathy Fuller-Seeley is going to tell us just a few things about that as we get organized for the screenings of Francis Ford. So thank you again. Professor Seeley from the University of Texas at Austin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, gentlemen. We could be, this is why they've written so many books, because we could be talking for so many hours about these wonderful topics. I'm going to keep my comments short because I want to show you these marvelous films that I first discovered just a couple years ago. To set the scene really quickly, if you were able to join us last night, when Francis Ford learned about motion picture acting and the basics of directing while working with Gaston Méliès in San Antonio, Texas, making Western dramas and comedies. Gaston Méliès moved his troupe out to Santa Paula, California, and they continued making those films, but he got so ahead, he had so many, they worked so fast, that he had so many releases in the can ahead of schedule, he just plain, Gaston just plain fired everybody in late October 1911. So, Francis Ford needed a job. He heard that the New York Motion Picture Company's branch in Los Angeles wanted to make westerns, and so he applied for and got a job with them to be a director. Unfortunately, so he was hired by the West Coast manager of the New York Motion, the Bison Company, New York Motion Picture Company. Unfortunately, at the same time, the two bookies who were the company in New York hired a guy named Thomas Ince, who had just finished working with Imp and Edison. They hired him to be the director of the Bison Company. So Francis Ford thinks he's gotten himself a job as a director, finally, the end of 1911, the beginning of 1912. Well, Thomas Ince comes to town and he goes, oh no, sorry, I'm the director. But he gives Francis, but he says, we're gonna make a spectacular Western. What Ince did was to hire a Wild West company of 500 actual Native Americans and skilled cowboy rodeo riders who were wintering out there in Venice, California. He also leased 100 and some acres in the Santa Monica Canyon, Arizona Inez Canyon, right there at where Sunset Boulevard hits the ocean. And you put those two things together, and the Bison films of 1912 are the most spectacular westerns that were ever, that nobody had seen anything like them. He gave Francis Ford a bone and said, I will let you be the star of these films. And then so that started in January, and they take the film world by storm. No one has ever seen such scenery, such authenticity of acting, and things like that. Ford finally got the ability to have his own unit and direct his own films in May of 1912. So this is talking about 10 months after the film we saw last night, When the Tables Turned. His first film, using the facilities, the marvelous Santa Ynez Canyons and the Santa Monica Mountains, and all these trained Native American performers. And he wrote his own film scripts. He directed and he starred in this film, a two-reeler called The Post Telegrapher. Now he runs a telegraph machine, but you say the Post Telegrapher doesn't sound as good, right, as telegrapher. So that's how I think it's pronounced. It was a huge hit in the spring and summer of 1912. I think you're going to see a lot of things that speak to the discussions we've been having about going on about later John Ford things. Watch especially for the way the women act here. You're going to see Francis Ford does very, very well with actresses as well as actors. I want to keep more questions for afterwards. So can we be ready to show our film? I want to show the film. Yay! Can we hit the light? What? Yay! So, hey boy, make a word that this film, I found half at the Library of Congress and half of it in the I collection in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And I had to translate the subtitles back from Dutch. Shoot 'em! That wasn't too hard. You'll find out more. That just